Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to my channel, guys. It's Diva Divine. Surviving R. Kelly. Behind Closed Doors. Part 5. More to come. And an interview with Tamara Simmons, the director of Surviving R. Kelly, and her crew do an interview on a podcast show. Please enjoy the show. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And please leave your comments below. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming on the Billboard Sharpie podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess the first question will just start at the beginning. What was the original impetus for this series, and why now, when there's been talk about the allegations against R. Kelly, rumors, so much talk for so long? Time frame. Why was it now, and how did it get started?
Yeah, sure. So you're right. The allegations and rumors for decades now, but in particular, in around early summer 2017. We actually noticed that there were some new articles coming up detailing news stories of alleged victims who had come forward. And around that time, we saw the Me Too movement take off. And so what Tamara and I did after we saw the first article come out is we did some digging and certainly read all the articles that had dated back 30 years or so. And one conversation that we had was, why isn't the Me Too movement receiving these victims maybe the same way as other victims who have been coming forward? And so Tamara and I wanted to get in touch with some of the certain new survivors who had come forward. And so we slowly kind of worked our way and got introduced to one and another and learned their story, heard everything that they had been through, and kind of started putting puzzle pieces together, and realized just that we had something really important to tell here.
And so when it came to this series, from what I read, and I think Bree has mentioned this before, it originally was supposed to be, or at least the conception was maybe a 60 to 90 minute sort of, one-stop shop documentary. And how did it evolve from that into what is nearly, 6 hours over 3 nights? What was that like for you all when you just found more and more that made it just, much more that you had to tell?
Well, when Jesse and Tamara and team came to me with the pitch, they had about 2 or 3 survivors and 2 sets of parents. And I think, some of those survivors, everyone sort of had cold feet, because you're really trusting someone with a story that kind of was told many times in the last couple of decades, but kind of fell on deaf ears. So I got to work on the research part, and we all sort of came together, and it made sense to go back to the very beginning and sort of make this a timeline doc. And once we did that, we still didn't know. Is it still going to, we didn't know how many hours it was going to be until we were done with it.
Yeah, I echo what Bree's saying. There are so many people who have watched the story now, watched the documentary now, said, "Oh my gosh, I can't forget. I had no idea that happened back in the 90s." And so part of our intention of doing this timeline, part of our discussion was that in order to understand what the newer survivors are going through, what the parents are going through now, you have to understand the patterns that have been in place that date back, 30 years.
And so I know Sparkle had come out and said, Sparkle, for those who don't know, is one of the participants in the documentary. She was a singer, or she is a singer, rather, I should say, who worked with R. Kelly very prominently in the 90s, had a couple chart hits with him. So she's very much involved in that camp. She had mentioned that she had sat for about 3, 4, 5 hours just by herself telling her story and relating what happened in her experiences. So for those who don't know, I just want to give them sort of a sense of scope. How much footage do you think you acquired over this time? Because I think some people think a documentary that's, 6 hours, you probably have 7 hours of footage and, you basically have the story right there. But how much really material did you have to work with and how did you cut it down?
That's a great question. I don't think we could ever put a real number to the hours that were shot, but certainly with Sparkle, we sat down for 6 or 7 hours. With a lot of people, we were there for hours and hours, and they were sharing their stories, and it was certainly very emotional and intense. And that's the hard part is cutting it down to 6 hours, which is a long time to tell this story. But even then, you're working with so much footage and so many different stories you have to weave together. It was not an easy process, but we made sure we had enough room in the post-production process to be able to kind of try a few different things.
How emotional was it for all of you working on this project? As professionals, you know you have to get this done, but this is such emotional content, and obviously it's incomparable to the brave women on camera. But what was it like for all of you?
Yeah. From the very beginning, it was just emotional just to hear their stories. And actually, I'm like, is this really real? And then talking to the families and then meeting some other survivors, they had similar stories. Every single time I heard a story, I was just surprised at everything that I was hearing. And I just couldn't believe it. So after a while, I just, you do get emotional, but you still have to be strong for them. And of course, they would call me at 2, 3 in the morning, and they would say, am I doing the right thing coming out, and things like that. And you still have to encourage them. And I was encouraging myself, and I was encouraging Jesse, and Jesse was probably encouraging Bree. So it was like everyone had to keep everyone's spirits up because it was so heavy. And as you can see, everyone has been saying, this was so hard to watch. Some people can't get all the way through it. Some people are just now texting me or calling me saying, I just finished it. I couldn't watch it all. And we lived it for 2 years almost. So it was very draining, but it was very rewarding to see how supportive these women are and how brave they are. And, they're getting stronger every day.
I have 2 questions kind of based off that. One thing, as the people who are making this film, and as you mentioned, being so heavily involved, and there's so many people that are relying on you to tell this story. These are people who have been, exploited and tricked before, and I think there's a lot of times in this country, especially right now, there's sort of a distrust in media. So how do you create an environment of trust, that allows these women to feel comfortable sharing these experiences that obviously must be very raw and very, uncomfortable sometimes to relive?
I think, and Jesse and Tamara can answer this probably better than I can, but I think, from being on set, and just the approach was patience first, because I think a lot of these, women, these survivors, these participants along the way had been screaming into the wind and hadn't been heard. And I think it took a lot of patience, which then it was a breeding ground for trust, to let them know that, they would be heard when they shared their story with us. So when they did sit down in that chair and do these interviews, I think there was that in mind. And that's why they were very long interviews. It wasn't just because we had so many questions. It was just they had so much to say. And it was a safe place for them to share those stories.
Yeah, I agree. And then also when we partnered with Lifetime, because Jesse and I, we had to gain their trust initially, so they trusted us. And then when we partnered with Lifetime, they were very, they felt like my voice really is going to be heard because it's Women's Network. And so they were really excited and happy about that at the same time. So I think just partnering with the right network also helped them have the confidence that they didn't have before.
And one thing that you mentioned before is the scale of time that you got to know these women over so many weeks and months. Do you still keep in touch with any of them after the filming was completed? Were you able to link any of them together who may not have known each other? Are those relationships, what are those like today?
Yeah, well, as I'm interviewing now and we're talking, I'm texting one of them. So they still text every day, and we still have to encourage them every day because they do receive the negative backlash, but they have so much support. And I just, try to stay positive for them and keep them, remind them of how brave they are. So I'm in contact with them every day, pretty much from morning until night.
You actually brought up something as well that is interesting, which is that even though some of their stories don't cross over, that they've experienced different things at different years, today, now, they're all kind of healing together. A lot of them have become friendly with one another, and they see each other as a support system, which is something we're really proud of.
Yeah, I just saw Kitty Jones. She put a picture of her and Asante and Javante. I guess they were at a restaurant, and that was the first time that they met with each other. And the caption just read that, we're sisters for life.
Did you have those kind of expectations when you went into making this? That it sounds like it's kind of one of those things that happens just as it all develops. And obviously, you didn't think you were going to get over 50 interviews. So now, as you said, the support system, that's another benefit.
I think this entire experience has exceeded all of our expectations. Every day seems like there's some more news breaking. During the course of production, there was always someone new to interview that was coming out. So I think all of this has exceeded our expectations, and it's just been the largest privilege that we have been able to be a part of it.
I'm curious about how you said it went from maybe a couple participants at first to over 50. What was it like, the process of getting up to that many people sharing their stories?
I think there were three things really that were helpful. So the first thing was research, so just really figuring out what the timeline was. And because it's such a rabbit hole on so many fronts that you sort of fall into it, and one thing happens and then another thing happened and then another thing happened in terms of tracking that. That sort of showed us who we needed to try and reach out to. So that was the first thing, was creating the timeline and understanding what it really was. The second thing, I think, is just the people. So every time, these guys reached out and talked to someone and actually got them into the chair and spent the time with them listening to their story, at the end of every interview was the question, is there someone else that you think would like to talk to us? Is there someone else that you think that we could know about that we should try and reach out to? And would you be comfortable with sharing that information? And I think most times people came back and said, you should meet with so-and-so, or, I worry about so-and-so. And from there, it was more research and more outreach. The third thing, I think, is just the platform that Lifetime is just, it's a platform for women that's a very courageous platform. So having that as a backing, I think, as Tamara and Jesse said, made it easier for people to say yes.
I do think we probably should talk about a few people who are not in the documentary. And first and foremost, R. Kelly himself does not make an appearance. How many times, I assume you must have reached out to his camp, how many times did you try to engage with his camp, and was there any sort of breakthrough, any indication that maybe he would be willing to talk or provide anything for this?
Yeah, we never came in with any sort of expectation whether or not he would want to participate or not, but we certainly felt like we needed to at least give him and his camp an opportunity to respond. So we did that, and they chose not to.
Was it an active denial, or was it just radio silence from them?
I believe we never really got an answer from them in the end.
No surprise.
Which is a standard, I guess, that we all learned, right? Like when you're producing a documentary, or someone's writing an article, or, the news is covering something, you always do the proper, thing, which you have to follow legal protocol, which is reaching out to, said individual or corporation and say, this is what we're doing, and these are the details of what we're doing. Would you care to respond or participate in any way? So all of those things were done.
And so we also see, of course, John Legend is in there, Wendy Williams, a few other plenty of notables. Is there anybody, whether it's celebrity or non-celebrity, is there anybody in particular that you really wish had been able to participate? And what do you think that they could have at least clarified or commented on that would have helped flush the story out even more?
We've all had this conversation. We think that everybody that was supposed to be in the doc is actually in the doc. We feel like it's complete. I think the participants that are in it, as well as, other people who may not have been in it, everybody has their own timing and what feels right for them to do. We are so grateful that so many people have spoken out now, celebrities, regular folk who are having this conversation now is the stuff that's really supporting these survivors, and keeping that support and those arms wrapped around them is extremely important right now.
I think that brings up an important point because, as is alluded to several times in the documentary itself, a few times even in this conversation, weirdly enough, this is a story that has been, sort of whispered about, followed around for multiple decades. And now we arrive at this point with this documentary where, once again, it's very top of mind. A lot of people talking about it. Kudos to you all for stories and situations and links that people had not seen before, even with what seemed to be so much evidence out there. How do we not let this, end up being another sort of 3 weeks R. Kelly's top of mind and, okay, somehow everything settles back to where it is? What can ordinary people do? We've seen so many people boycott his music. We've seen people take active stands against his concerts. What more can people do who really feel moved and energized to want to, make sure this does not fall by the wayside again?
Yeah, that's the big question is how do we keep the conversation moving forward? And it's really at this point out of our hands. And we're just proud to see that people are continuing to talk about it. Celebrities are continuing to talk about it. And so really, we've been getting messages from all kinds of people in all industries who say they've watched it. Families have watched it together, and people on social media are tweeting about it. Even memes are being made about it. And so really, it's just about continuing just a dialogue going forward. And if people are choosing not to play his music again because of it, if they're choosing not to go to his shows because of it, that's all part of the conversations that are happening. And we can only hope that continues to happen, that people continue to make educated decisions, that they see this and they talk amongst one another and they decide what do they want to do now.
Bree, I also want to talk, and you mentioned a little bit about the legal questions that you obviously need to try to get a response from R. Kelly's camp, or at least inform them. When an idea like this comes to you, and what legal and practical things do you have to make sure you're very much aware of when something like this happens, with so many allegations that must be said have never been proven per se in a court of law, nothing definitive, things that are still going on to this day at this very moment? What do you have to manage and be careful of when you do a project as intense as this?
Being diligent about, the facts that are at hand, and I think that's where the timeline actually came into play. I mean, there were a lot of boxes to check, on our end and also on creative's end in terms of staying in line with what would be allowed from legal point of view. It was a very arduous process.
And so even, you have the 6 hours that are officially released. There's probably countless more hours still of footage logged elsewhere. We answer so many questions about the links, the timeline, the people, the circumstances. What questions do you still have, even after such a detailed and thorough documentary? What's still out there that makes you wonder, what you couldn't quite grasp?
It's hard to kind of analyze now what questions are still out there that for us are unanswered. I feel like we in telling the story, we looked at every single element that dated back years, and everything from the stories of our survivors to his career and where those intersect. I feel like we did as thorough a process as possible in researching and putting together the doc.
At the same time, conversely, when you all feel that way, what is it like to hear that all these allegations R. Kelly is denying? He's refuting content that you've worked on, again, for so long, so many hours, you've talked to so many people. What reaction do you have when you hear that? Everything you just put out, he's saying, not true.
Well, I think we were all prepared for him to deny a lot of the allegations or all of them. So, I mean, that's partly why we had to continue to encourage the survivors to just, speak their truth and stand on their truth.
And after all of this, we see, as with anything R. Kelly, even the response from social media, there's plenty of people who are championing this work and very supportive of it, and there's still a very vocal contingent who are loyal and supportive to R. Kelly. And even in the course of the documentary, for those who haven't seen, there are several women, I think in the 2000s who meet R. Kelly, 2010s, who admit that they were fans and they had heard the rumors and they just dismissed them or didn't believe them or thought that they would be different or whatnot. Over the course of filming this, and there's also some experts, some psychologists, and so not just direct victims, but some experts in the medical field, do you have any sense or why people would still support R. Kelly even after all of this and even after the airing of this documentary?
I guess we can go to how Nelson George unpacked it in the doc, and I do think that that's true. His point was so much of that music was a part of so many people's lives, whether it was, the first wedding dance or, the song that people played at the family reunion. The music is definitely a part of people's lives, and that may be what's difficult for people to separate, the music from the man.
I think one of the things that the documentary does, it does attempt to try to understand some levels of how some of this behavior, whether it started or continued, and you get into issues that he was alluring as such a big star that a young woman could be drawn in by that. It really goes deep into not just here's what happened, but here's how these awful details that come up.
No, that's all really good point, which was that R. Kelly has been a massive celebrity for many years, and there's something magnetic about his music, and so that was part of what we tried to do, was try to set up that context, so you did understand when our survivors told their stories, how that first meeting or whatever that was, how why maybe they were drawn to him. And so we try to create that context so people could understand the big picture.
I think maybe one of the biggest takeaways is you hear so many of these stories, and a thread is because they were so young. A lot of the original thinking at the time was, this behavior seems a little off. What R. Kelly is asking and some of these demands he's making, but. He's older. Maybe this is normal. I should just go along with it. And to hear so many people say that, I think one of the biggest things, the benefits from this is that this discussion is being had now. And maybe in years past, decades past, this was never talked about. And this is such a key part of moving forward, that if something doesn't seem right, people seem to be talking about it more than they would have in the past. And to hear everyone saying those same kinds of details, if nothing else, it's great that that's all coming forward and everyone can realize, something doesn't feel right. This does need to be talked about.
That's been the thing that's been so mind-blowing for all of this, that this sparks such a global conversation. And that, what is actually really interesting is all the legwork that the Me Too movement did and the Time's Up movement did. This documentary ended up becoming a catalyst for more conversation that seemed to blur gender and race lines. Like, it's men talking about this, it's women talking about this, it's parents talking to their kids about this. And, I think we all needed to be re-educated about sexual violence and how to stop it. And I think there's an unpacking, too, of the notion of shame. So it's very heady.
How are you all different after having been through this process? What has this taught you and maybe changed in your own life?
Well, for me, I have a daughter myself, and so it just taught me, like, as a mother, just to make sure that we have those conversations that I didn't think about before, haven't thought about before. and it's also helping to her to see it in the, all the hard work that she saw us doing, and then she's seeing the impact now, and then she's like, Mom, this was great. So I think just it's helping me with my family.
To be honest, I almost feel like I haven't had too much time to unpack everything that we've learned. There's been a lot, but I do feel like personally going through this experience that there's just so many layers to when you hear someone's story, when you read a headline in the news, there's so much more than just that. And I feel like, like we've seen these victims of R. Kelly's come out at various years and various times, and we're so quick to just read a headline and then rush to judgment. And I feel like for me, you have to understand there's so many layers to everyone's story, especially when it comes to abuse and getting into an abusive situation, that you owe it to anybody who's gone through that not to rush to judgment and to really try to listen to their story, try to understand it, and put yourself in their position.
And I guess for me, there's so many things. I think just the message of being human, and human means believing people sometimes, and sort of giving ourselves permission to do that, and to treat each other with kindness, I think is something that's just reiterated over and over again every time I rewatch a segment or the whole episode, or remember these stories from the participants and the survivors.
When I was walking even to work today, I was reliving the part kind of at the end where I forget her name. I'm blanking on her name, but she, as with many, she's one of the ones who I believe was outside maybe the courthouse or had met R. Kelly at a concert, and he had given her his phone number. And to me, it almost felt like that scene maybe in a horror movie where, like, we at a distance, of course, having watched this, you're like, no, that's how it starts. And then, why would you take his phone number? Why would you call him? And I had to stop and think to myself, like, wait a minute. In a horror movie, it's like the same thing. We always sit there and think, why would you take the hitchhike ride? Why would you go upstairs? Like, we never think, why does this killer keep killing people? What's up with that? It's always sort of shifted onto the victim of why did you put yourself in that kind of way? And so that was probably the best comparison I could think of. But to the point about not rushing to judgment, knowing that there's much more to any story, the circumstances that shape the victim in particular, that's something that we all need to pause and recognize and acknowledge. And as one of you mentioned before, there, but by the grace of God, go, any of us really.
Yeah.
To that point, the ending I think is really poignant because there's the song by Sparkle, the new song, but also the series ends with the update of many of the victims. And why was that decision made, and what was necessary about trying to end the series on that note and really not on R. Kelly?
I think just the journey of this documentary it was never about him. It was the platform for these women to tell their stories. And someone once said something like, your authenticity is your superpower, right? And you see these very truthful and honest accounts from these women through the course of the documentary. And the one piece that always stuck out to me in terms of being extremely impactful was for them to identify themselves as survivors, right? That's where they were. They are now at a different place where they've stood in their truth, and they are now out of situations that they no longer want to be in. And all of that is so empowering and reflective of the journey. And so we wanted to end it with where they are now, because that's what this whole doc has been about. Also, just watching it is supportive. I mean, to your point of like, what can people do? When we put it together, the more people that were interviewed, there was a power in that, the power in numbers, and we've talked about that a lot, in this journey. And then what was interesting also that we all saw was, there was a gun threat at the screening, and I think it was December 4th. and we had to evacuate. You know, 20 or 25 minutes into the documentary, and the faces of the survivors that were so heartbroken because I think they felt silence again. You know, that's what they had said. And what was interesting about that moment and powerful about that moment was there was a lot of press there. There were a lot of, you know, journalists and bloggers and people that were there that I don't think knew what they were going to see until they saw it, and they had only seen a piece of it, and they felt the need to rally around them. You know, there was an actual mini rally outside once we were evacuated and everyone was outside safely. And what I will say is people like you, you know, Trevor and Gary, and all of the journalists and the newsmakers and the people that can keep this conversation going, you know, there's power in all of those numbers. You guys are the ones that keep this story going. Could be put to bed after the documentary is over, but everybody, I think, feels that this is a conversation that surpasses the doc, you know, a conversation about how we take care of ourselves. And all of that stuff is so helpful and supportive for the survivors of, you know, of this doc and many other survivors out there, is to know that, you know, they can be heard.
Well, I know it couldn't have been easy to tell, and certainly tough emotional moments. But we thank you again for bringing this to an even bigger spotlight than it has, and hopefully, as you all have alluded to, this conversation doesn't stop here with just this documentary, but it keeps going, and most importantly, that these victims are able to find peace and healing. And I'm glad that some of them have been able to connect with each other, and you know, the strength in numbers, of course, in that way too. So. Really, for all involved, just, I mean, well done all around.
Thank you. This has been, I think I speak for all of us, one of the biggest privileges of our lives. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.